The rain had been falling on the city for 3 days without apology, streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Callaway Group's 42nd floor offices in long silver lines that made the whole skyline look like it was weeping. Celine Marsh noticed this the way she noticed most things, quietly, without announcing it, from her desk in the far corner of the executive suite, where the fluorescent light above her had been flickering for 6 weeks, and nobody had fixed it. She had submitted 3 maintenance requests. She had stopped submitting them. The flicker had become part of her rhythm, a small strobe that marked the seconds between tasks, the way a metronome marks music. And Celine had learned long ago that you either made peace with the things that irritated you, or you spent your life being irritated. She was 28 years old. She had made a great many pieces. Her desk was technically called the Executive Coordination Station on the office floor plan, which was a title that sounded grand and meant she fielded every call, drafted every letter, managed every calendar, sourced every gift, booked every flight, remembered every allergy, and anticipated every need for a man she had worked beside for 14 months, without once being invited to sit in the same meeting room as him. She was the architecture of his professional life. She was also, in every meaningful social sense, invisible. She had engineered that invisibility herself, had layered it on like the oversized gray cardigans she rotated through her wardrobe, the oatmeal one, the steel one, the charcoal one, each of them large enough to swallow the heavy fullness of her hips and the soft, deep curve of her stomach and the generous weight of her chest. She had learned to take up less visual space than she actually occupied. It was a skill, like all the others. She was very good at it. His name was Dorian Voss, and she had been almost certain, for 14 months, that he did not know hers. The office knew his name the way a body knows its own heartbeat, not consciously, not with thought, but with the kind of biological necessity that makes your pulse jump when a door opens and the temperature in the room drops 2 degrees before he has fully crossed the threshold. The rain kept falling. Celine kept working. She did not know that today everything would change. The letter had come across her desk at 7:43 in the morning, which was 11 minutes before anyone else arrived, because Celine always arrived first. It came from the desk of Marcus Webb, head of acquisitions, flagged urgent and marked for the personal attention of Dorian Voss, and the moment Celine unfolded it and read the first paragraph, she felt the specific stillness that came over her when numbers told her something terrible. She was an accountant by training, a forensic one, though her title here was only personal assistant and executive coordinator, because Marcus Webb had reviewed her application and decided someone her size was better suited to support work than analytical work, and she had needed the job too badly to correct him. She had told herself it was temporary. 14 months later, she still sat under the flickering light, but she had spent those 14 months reading everything that crossed her desk, and she understood the Callaway Group's financial architecture better than anyone in the building except possibly Dorian Voss himself. The letter from Marcus Webb was written on Callaway Group letterhead, which meant it had been drafted in-house. It was addressed to Elara Capital, a mid-tier investment firm whose principal had been in quiet acquisition talks with Callaway for 6 weeks. The letter was gracious, complimentary, professionally warm, and it was wrong in 4 specific and devastating ways that anyone who understood the group's actual tax exposure and liquidation thresholds would recognize immediately. The proposed acquisition terms would trigger a phantom income event on 3 subsidiary accounts. The indemnification clause was written in a way that transferred liability for a $9 million regulatory penalty Callaway had been managing in quiet settlement to the acquiring party, which would blow the deal the moment Elara Capital's attorneys reviewed it. The valuation anchor used to justify the offer price was based on a balance sheet that had been restructured 2 quarters ago, meaning the number was 14% inflated, and the signatory line bore Dorian Voss's name. Marcus Webb had prepared a letter for Dorian Voss to sign that would, if sent, Either detonate a 6-week negotiation or expose Callaway Group to the kind of liability that made attorneys write books about it. Celine sat with the letter in her hands for a long moment. The fluorescent light flickered above her. Rain moved across the window. She could hear the elevator beginning its morning ascent somewhere in the building's bones. She thought about what a competent personal assistant would do. A competent personal assistant would put the letter in the urgent folder and bring it to Dorian Voss's attention when he arrived and allow him to deal with it, because that was what a personal assistant did, and that was the boundary she had carefully maintained. She had not been hired to analyze. She had been hired to coordinate. She had a flickering light above her desk and 3 unanswered maintenance requests and 0 invitations to the meeting rooms where decisions were made, and the correct professional behavior was to maintain her lane. Celine set the letter down. She opened her desk drawer and took out a fresh legal pad. She picked up her pen. She drafted the corrected letter herself, from scratch, in 38 minutes, restructuring every clause, adjusting the valuation basis with a footnote, explaining the Q3 restructure, rewriting the indemnification language to protect Callaway without exposing Elara, and preserving the relational warmth of the original tone so that the offer still read as gracious rather than defensive. It was, she thought objectively, a much better letter. Then she placed it in the urgent folder alongside the original, wrote a 2-paragraph memo explaining the 4 technical errors and their probable consequences, and waited. She did not have to wait long. Dorian Voss arrived at 7:59. She knew this not because she looked up, but because the room temperature changed. It happened the way it always happened. She heard the elevator open. She heard the particular silence that preceded him, the way conversation in the outer office halted and then resumed at a different pitch, careful and calibrated, the way people spoke when they were aware of being watched. She heard his footsteps, which were unhurried and absolutely even on the marble floor, and then she felt rather than heard the moment he entered the executive suite, because the air in the room seemed to make a decision about itself. Dorian Voss was 6'3", broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had been built rather than assembled, with dark hair worn close, and features that suggested his face had been cut rather than molded. Sharp jaw, sharp cheekbones, a straight blade of a nose that had been broken once and set without much ceremony. He wore black always. Black suit today, charcoal so deep it registered as black in most lighting, white shirt without tie, the collar open by precisely 1 button in a way that suggested not casualness, but a decision to allow himself 1 millimeter of informality, and no more. He was 32. He had been running the Callaway Group's legitimate holdings since 27 and the other operations since 24, and he carried both things in the same even stillness. He went directly to his office without looking at her. He always went directly to his office without looking at her. Celine stood, gathered the urgent folder, and knocked on his door. "Come," he said. She opened the door and crossed to his desk and placed the folder in front of him. "Mr. Voss, there are 2 documents in that folder. I'd recommend reviewing both before your 8:15. He did not look up. "Leave it." "I will," she said. "I want to flag that the first document has several technical issues that could affect the Elara negotiation. I've detailed them in the memo." He looked up then. She kept her eyes on the wall slightly above his left shoulder, which was a habit she had developed to avoid the full weight of his attention. He had dark eyes, obsidian almost, so dark the iris was difficult to separate from the pupil, and when they focused on a person, that person tended to have the sensation of being counted rather than looked at. "Who wrote the memo?" he said. It was not a question. "I did." A silence. "You're a PA." "Yes." "Sit down, miss." A pause so brief she almost missed it. "Marsh." He knew her name. Celine sat. She had been sitting in that chair for 7 minutes when his stillness began to shift in a way she did not know how to categorize. He read everything, both letters, twice. her memo, 3 times. He did not speak. His hands, bare today, he sometimes wore thin black driving gloves in the morning hours. She had noticed this without analyzing it. It was simply a thing she knew. Were flat on the desk and absolutely still. And then one of them moved and turned to the second page of her memo, and his index finger traced a single line of text without touching the paper, hovering just above it, the way a person moves a finger over something they are reading carefully enough to hold physically in place. The 4 errors she had identified were not errors. She understood that now, sitting very still in the chair and watching him read, and feeling the shape of the realization settling in her chest, like cold water finding its level. The letter Marcus Webb had drafted had not been incompetent. It had been deliberate. Someone had prepared a document designed to bear Dorian Voss's signature on terms that would, at minimum, cost the group millions, and at maximum, expose it to the kind of regulatory and civil liability that created leverage, the kind of leverage that certain parties in certain competing interests had been looking to establish for months. She had read enough internal correspondence to understand the geography of the Callaway Group's enemies, and she had drafted her corrected letter without fully understanding what she was correcting, and now she understood completely. "Mr. Voss," she said. "I see it," he said. "Marcus Webb." "I see it, Miss Marsh." His voice had not changed. It was still even, still low, still carrying the unhurried weight of a man who did not raise his register for anything. But something behind the words was different. Something behind the evenness had gone very quiet in a specific way that made Celine feel the distance between the chair she was sitting in and the door she had entered through. He picked up his phone. He did not dial. He simply held it for a moment and then set it back down, and the gesture told her something she could not quite translate. Then he looked at her, fully, the way he had not looked at her in 14 months. "You identified 4 technical failures in a document drafted by the head of acquisitions," he said, and produced a corrected version in, he glanced at the timestamp on her memo, 38 minutes. "Yes. Before 8 in the morning. I arrive early." "I know you arrive early," he said, and the sentence landed differently than she expected, with a weight that suggested it was not new information to him. "What is your academic background?" "Accounting." "Graduate level, forensic concentration." Something moved in his face. Not much. The smallest shift at the corner of his jaw. "You have been coordinating my calendar." "Yes." "For 14 months." "Yes." "Because Webb approved your hire." She did not answer that. She looked at the wall above his left shoulder and kept her hands folded in her lap, the way she always sat, making herself small in the chair the way she had learned to make herself small in every room she occupied. She was not small. She knew she was not small. She was a tall woman and a heavy one, with wide hips and a full stomach and thighs that pressed the fabric of her dress even through the oversized cardigan she wore over it, and she had spent years learning to compress the space she took up, to fold herself in and down until she disappeared into the background geometry of a room. She was very good at it. She had been invisible for 14 months. "Look at me," he said. She moved her gaze from the wall to his face. The full weight of his attention was considerable. She felt it, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, something physical and directional, pressing. "Who told you to stay in that chair?" he said. The question made no sense, and perfect sense simultaneously. She did not have an answer for it that was also a safe answer, so she said nothing. Dorian Voss held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stood, which brought him to his full height, and he said, "I'll need you in the strategy room at 9. What I'm about to do with this information is going to require documentation of a very specific kind. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "Good." He picked up the phone again, and this time he dialed, and Celine understood she was dismissed. She stood and moved to the door, and as she reached it, his voice came behind her. quieter, carrying differently in the room now. "Miss Marsh." She turned. "The letter you drafted," he said, without looking up from the phone. "It's the one I'll be sending." She left the office. She sat back down at her desk under the flickering light. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was not sure why her pulse was not. By 9:15, Celine had been inside the strategy room for 12 minutes, and Marcus Webb's world had ended, though he did not know it yet. The strategy room was everything her desk corner was not. All warm amber light and dark wood and the smell of expensive coffee she had been pouring for other people at these tables for 14 months, without ever being invited to drink it. Today she sat at the table, not beside it, not along the wall with the assistants and schedulers who stood and waited, but at it, in a chair that Dorian Voss had pulled back himself and indicated with a single motion of one hand. Dorian Voss sat at the head of the table. His second-in-command, Rafferty Cole, sat at his right, a lean, quiet man in his mid-30s, with close-cropped silver at his temples and the particular kind of stillness that came from years of doing things that did not appear on organizational charts. 3 attorneys sat along one side. Celine sat on the other, with her legal pad and her 2 pens, and the folder she had prepared. Marcus Webb was escorted in at 9:22 by 2 men Celine had never seen before, which meant they did not work for the Callaway Group's legitimate holdings. Webb was 43, well-dressed, pink-faced, and currently the color of old chalk. He sat where he was directed to sit and looked at the assembled attorneys and then at Rafferty Cole and then at Dorian Voss, and did not look at Celine at all, because people like Marcus Webb look through people like Celine even in their worst moments. "Marcus," Dorian Voss said pleasantly. The pleasantness was precise and absolute and deeply frightening, in a way that Celine recognized from the internal correspondence she had processed for 14 months. When Dorian Voss used a pleasant tone, it was the tone of a decision that had already been made. "I reviewed the Alara Capital letter this morning," Dorian Voss continued, in the same pleasant, unhurried voice, "the one you prepared for my signature. I can explain." "You can't," Dorian Voss said, still pleasant, still unhurried, "but you're welcome to try while the attorneys listen." Webb tried. He produced explanations that were creative in the way that desperation is sometimes creative. Systems errors, data feeds, a new analyst who had made the valuation pull, a miscommunication in the indemnification language, a clerical problem with the timeline on the subsidiary accounts. He produced them quickly, the way a person who has rehearsed a story speaks when the rehearsed story is clearly not working, which is to say faster and louder than the actual words warranted. No one at the table took notes. Celine took notes. She had been trained to document, and she documented everything, because that was what she did, and also because she had understood from the moment she walked into this room that what was happening here would need a very precise paper trail. At 9:41, Dorian Voss said, "Enough." Webb stopped. "The woman sitting across from you identified all 4 material errors in your letter before 8 this morning," Dorian Voss said, in the same tone he might use to describe weather. "She corrected them in 38 minutes and provided a memo that documents exactly what you did and why it would have been catastrophic for this group. I have that memo. I have the original letter. I have the corrected version. I have the timestamps." Webb looked at Celine for the first time. There was a specific quality to the way he looked at her, a rapid recalibration behind his eyes, that she had seen before on the faces of men who had filed her in the wrong folder and were now confronting the administrative consequences of that decision. He opened his mouth. "Don't," Dorian Voss said. Webb closed his mouth. What happened after that was brisk and ruthless and entirely legal, or legal enough, and Rafferty Cole handled the logistics of it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done considerably worse before breakfast on slower mornings. The attorneys produced documents. Webb signed them. The two men Celine did not recognize ensured that Webb's departure from the building involved no stops and no personal items beyond what he had in his pockets. Celine sat at the table and documented everything in her small, precise handwriting, and when the room had emptied down to herself and Dorian Voss and the smell of coffee, she closed her legal pad and looked up. He was watching her. He had been watching her, she realized, for some portion of the last hour, in the way that she had been aware of as a peripheral sensation without naming it. His attention was directional. It had weight. It had been pointed at her across the table during the proceedings the way a lamp points light at something it is illuminating. "You're good at this," he said. She looked at her legal pad. "I took notes." "That's not what I mean." She looked up. He was still watching her with that precise, contained focus, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his shoulders perfectly still in the black suit. "What you did this morning," he said, "required technical fluency, professional courage, and the kind of institutional knowledge that takes years to build. You built it from a chair in the corner." Celine said nothing. "Why didn't you tell me what you knew?" he asked. She considered several answers. She chose the true one. Because no one asked. Something in the line of his jaw changed. Not much. Enough. "I'm asking now," he said. "I'm asking about everything you know about this group's finances that has not been brought to my attention." She placed her hand flat on her legal pad. "That will take more than one conversation." "I have time," Dorian Voss said. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without inflection, as though the statement was a simple accounting of fact. But he was still watching her, and the amber light of the room was warm on his face, and Celine felt something she did not have a name for yet moving through her chest, slow and alarmed and bright all at once. She uncapped her pen. She opened her legal pad. She began. The conversation lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It covered 3 subsidiaries, 2 offshore holding structures, a European licensing arrangement that had been generating phantom revenues for 6 quarters, and what Celine had quietly come to think of as the Belford problem, a series of account movements she had first noticed 8 months ago while processing payment authorizations, and had documented in a personal notebook she kept in her desk drawer, and had never shown to anyone because she had never been asked. She spread her materials across the table as she talked, adding pages of her own notes and several printed spreadsheets she had prepared over months in the margins of her official duties, building a picture that surprised even her in its completion, now that she was laying it out under direct light. Dorian Voss listened the way he did everything, without interruption, without visible reaction, with the absolute concentrated stillness of a man for whom information was power, and whose relationship with power was entirely unsentimental. He asked 4 questions in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Each one was precise and went straight to the load-bearing element of whatever she was describing, and each time he asked one, Celine felt the uncomfortable sensation of being seen clearly by someone who had, until 9 hours ago, been looking slightly past her. Rafferty Cole returned at noon, glanced at the table covered in Celine's materials, and raised one silver-templed eyebrow at Dorian Voss in a way that contained an entire conversation. "Clear my afternoon," Dorian Voss said. Rafferty Cole looked at the table again. Then he looked at Celine, and something in his expression shifted from assessment to something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it, the way a man looks at a fact that has reorganized his understanding of a situation. He nodded once and left. It was during the 3rd hour, when they had moved from the Belford problem into the European licensing arrangement, and Celine was explaining the mechanism by which the phantom revenues had been generated, that it happened. She had been leaning forward to point at a figure in the spreadsheet, and the motion shifted her weight and the oversized cardigan she wore, the charcoal one today, her defensive geography, slipped off one shoulder completely, and the dress beneath it was fitted and dark emerald, and it covered her, but it also, unavoidably, was her, the actual dimensions of her, the wide slope of her shoulder and the fullness of her upper arm, and the deep, rich curve of her where the fabric pulled. She felt the air on her shoulder and felt the exposure with the same reflex she always felt it, quick and cold, and she pulled the cardigan back up immediately and kept talking about the licensing figures because the only alternative was to stop and acknowledge it, and she had learned to treat the visibility of her body as a professional emergency that was best managed by continuing to function. Dorian Voss's gaze had moved. She had felt it even before she looked up. He was not looking at the spreadsheet. He was looking at her shoulder, at the curve of her arm, at the green fabric against the brown warmth of her skin. And there was something in the way he was looking that she did not have a clinical category for, because it was not dismissive, and it was not clinical, and it was not the quick look-away of polite disregard. He was looking at her the way he looked at information that mattered to him, specifically, without apology. She pulled the cardigan tighter. "I'm sorry," she said, reflexively, uselessly. "Don't," he said. She blinked. The cardigan just... "Don't apologize," he said, and the sentence was quiet and absolute. "For what you look like." Silence. The rain was still falling on the windows, thinner now, the city beginning to clear outside. The amber light sat warm in the room between them. "It's just," she started. "It's not just anything," he said. His voice had dropped, the baritone settling into a register she had never heard him use, something rough at its edges, unhurried but different in texture from the boardroom evenness. "I've been watching you fold yourself into that corner for 14 months. I haven't done anything about it. That's a failure I intend to correct." Celine said, "I don't know what that means." "It means," he said, "that you are going to stop sitting under that flickering light. It means that every notebook you have been keeping in that desk drawer is going to be reviewed and acted on. It means that Marcus Webb's position, and the financial oversight this group clearly requires, needs someone who already knows where every body is buried." He paused. "Figuratively." "Figuratively," she repeated, and something in her voice that she had not planned on made the corner of his mouth move, just slightly, the first time she had ever seen that happen. "Yes," he said, "figuratively." She looked down at her notes. She said carefully, "That would be a significant change to my role. It would be your correct role." "Mr. Voss." "Dorian," he said. Another silence. The rain, the amber light, the careful geometry of everything that was shifting between them in this room. "Dorian," she said, trying it. The word felt different in her mouth than she had expected. Heavier, more significant. "I want to be clear that what I did this morning was professionally motivated. I didn't do it to impress you. I did it because the letter was wrong and the consequences would have been material and it needed to be corrected." "I know," he said. "I'm saying that so you understand that I'm not asking for anything." "I know," he said again. Same voice, same steadiness. "You have never asked for anything. That is one of several things about you that I intend to change." He looked at her, fully, again, in that way that had weight and direction, and pressed against her like barometric change. "You are the most capable person in this building, Miss Marsh." Celine, trying hers back, deliberately. "And you have spent 14 months making yourself disappear. That ends today." She opened her mouth. She closed it. She was not accustomed to being seen, and being seen by him, specifically, by those dark eyes that counted rather than simply looked, was a thing her body did not have a prepared response to. She felt warm. She felt something behind her sternum that she recognized dimly as the particular pain of wanting something you have trained yourself not to want. "The Belford account," she said, because the Belford account was safe, and she understood it. "We should finish the analysis before end of day." "We should," he agreed. And he let her return to the numbers. But he did not stop watching her, and she felt it. warm and steady and specific, the whole rest of the afternoon. The Belford problem turned out to be worse than Celine's notebook had suggested, which was saying something because her notebook had suggested it was quite bad. By the time they had worked through the full account movement sequence, it was 6:15 in the evening, and the rain had stopped, and the city outside was that particular washed clear that cities get after long weather, every light sharper, every edge more defined. Rafferty Cole had come and gone twice, bringing materials each time, and once bringing food that Celine had not asked for, and which she ate without comment because she had been awake since 5:30. And had run entirely on black coffee for 10 hours, and her hands had started shaking slightly over her notes around 4 o'clock, which she had managed by pressing them flat against the table. Dorian had noticed. She knew he had noticed because at 4:17 a plate had appeared at her elbow, placed there by Rafferty Cole, who had not looked at her, and the plate had contained a sandwich and 2 things she had mentioned liking in an offhand comment to a coworker 8 months ago that she had no memory of him ever being present to hear. She had eaten the sandwich, she had not commented on it, he had not mentioned it. The full picture of the Belford account was this: over the course of 19 months, someone had been siphoning fractional amounts from a layered series of expense authorization accounts, never more than $4,000 from any single account in any single month, across enough accounts that the aggregate was significant, but the individual transactions were beneath the threshold of standard audit review. The mechanism was elegant. The amounts were specifically calibrated to remain invisible to automated flagging. And Celine, who processed payment authorizations and reconciled the expense accounts as part of her administrative duties, had started noticing the pattern 8 months ago, not through any formal analysis, but through the specific irritation she felt when numbers did not sit symmetrically, the way a perfectly organized desk feels wrong when one item is 3 centimeters out of place. Total extraction, Dorian Voss said, studying the aggregate figure she had compiled. Approximately 2.3 million over the 19-month period, Celine said. I want to be clear that I can't attribute a source without access to the administrative credentials for the authorization system, which I don't have. You'll have them, he said, and I'd want a forensic audit firm to verify my methodology before this goes to any legal proceeding. Of course, he was looking at the number, then he looked up. You've had this in a notebook in your desk for 8 months. I didn't know who to tell. You could have told me. She looked at him. You didn't know my name 3 months ago. The silence that followed was different from the other silences they'd had that day. Something in it had edges. I knew your name, he said quietly. She blinked. You paused, this morning, when you told me to sit down. You paused before you said my name. He held her gaze. I paused, he said, because I was deciding something. What were you deciding? Whether to keep pretending, he said, that I didn't know who you were. The amber light, the cleared city outside, the $2.3 million sitting on the table between them. That was the most concrete thing in the room, and all around it something else, something that did not have a spreadsheet column, spreading like warmth, or like the moment before weather changes. You knew who I was, she said. Celine, he said her name without the formal prefix, without the distance, just the word, and it landed in her, the way his attention landed, with weight and direction and specificity. I know what time you arrive. I know you take your coffee black. I know you resubmitted that maintenance request 3 times before you stopped. I know you have been building a shadow analysis of this group's finances in a notebook for 8 months. I know that you wear gray cardigans over dresses that would stop a room if you let them. His voice was lower now, the rough texture more present, something controlled and deliberate behind the words. I know exactly who you are. I have been watching you try to disappear for 14 months, and I have been, a pause, contained, careful, doing an inadequate job of the thing I should have done instead. Celine sat very still. The habit of smallness was profound in her, was muscle memory and reflex and the residue of years of understanding that her body was a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be inhabited. She felt the familiar contraction, the instinct to deflect, to reduce, to apologize for whatever it was she was taking up in the room. She stopped it. She looked at Dorian Voss across the table covered in her work, her months of careful, invisible labor now spread wide and acknowledged and consequential, and she said, "What should you have done?" He stood. He came around the table, not hurrying, not performing, just moving with that unhurried, lethal ease, until he was standing at her side, and then he crouched down to her eye level in a single smooth motion, bringing himself level with her, eye to eye, close enough that she could smell the cedar and clean cold of his cologne, and feel the warmth of him, and see clearly that his eyes were very dark and very steady and pointed entirely at her. "This," he said, "I should have done this 14 months ago, looked at you, actually looked." She did not look away. She had trained herself to look away, had perfected the art of sliding her gaze past his face to the safer geometry of the wall, and she did not do it. "I am not a small person," she said. There was nothing apologetic in it. There was something that trembled slightly but held, the way a voice holds when it is saying a true thing that has been swallowed for a long time. "I have never fit the shape of what people expected, and I have spent a lot of time trying to make myself fit by making myself smaller, and I am tired of being the PA who sits under the flickering light." "Good," he said. The word was low and absolute. "Because you're not going back to that chair. You never belonged in it." His gaze moved over her face, her throat, her shoulders, the emerald green fabric and what it held, slow and deliberate, and with a reverence that her body did not know how to receive gracefully, but received nonetheless, helplessly, like ground receiving rain. "Everything you have been hiding," he said, "is everything I have not been able to look away from. Do you understand me?" She understood him. She was not sure she was ready for what she understood, but she understood it completely. "I found the Belford account because the numbers bothered me," she said, which was true, and also a way of staying in the world she knew, while the other world moved closer. "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved again. The warmth of it was unreasonable. "You can finish the analysis tomorrow, in your new office, with a working light. You're giving me an office. I'm giving you the correct floor," he said, "and a title that matches what you actually do, and access to every system in this building." He held her gaze. "And whatever else you need, whatever else you should have had." She said, "I need to call the forensic audit firm in the morning. I know you do. And I want final sign-off on the corrected Ilara letter before it goes out. You'll have it." "And," she said, and here her voice did something she had not authorized it to do, something that was not professional, and not about the Belford account or the Ilara letter or the flickering light. "I don't know what to do with this, with what You don't have to do anything with it tonight," he said. His hand lifted from where it had been resting on the arm of her chair, and it came to rest instead against the side of her face, large and warm and barely touching, the lightest possible pressure at her jaw, his thumb a breath from the corner of her mouth. "Tonight you've corrected a $9 million mistake, exposed a $2.3 million fraud, and ended a career. That's sufficient." She laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, real and unguarded, and she felt him register it, felt something in the hand against her face shift into something less restrained. "Tomorrow," he said, "you're going to walk into this building as what you actually are. And I'm going to be very clear with everyone in it about what that means." He said it the way he said ultimatums, in the same quiet tone as a business order, except that this one was about her, and it pressed into her chest and settled there. warm and anchoring. You belong in this room, Celine. You belong on this floor. You have always belonged here. She looked at him, this man who wore black and never raised his voice, and had apparently been watching her try to disappear for 14 months, and had known her name the whole time, and had crouched down to her eye level in the strategy room, with his hand against her face. She let herself look. She had been trained not to, and she was tired of the training. "The letter," she said. "The one you should have written to Alara Capital. The correct version." "Yes. I wrote it for you." "You did," he said. "You've been doing that for a long time." "Things that should have been mine to do." His thumb moved, just barely, against the line of her jaw. "Starting now, we do them together." Outside, the city glittered in post-rain clarity, every light precise and clean, the kind of sharp-edged visibility that only comes after something heavy has finally cleared. Celine Marsh sat at the table that was no longer someone else's table, in the light that was warm and unflickering, looked at by eyes that counted her rather than passed her, and she stopped being invisible. She stopped by choice, for the first time, in a room that was hers. The corrected letter went to Alara Capital the following morning, bearing Dorian Voss's signature and Celine Marsh's revised language in every clause. The Alara principal called at 11 to say it was the clearest acquisition proposal his firm had received in 5 years. Rafferty Cole placed the compliment on Dorian's desk in a note that also contained, in Rafferty's economical handwriting, a single line. She found the rest of it too. 3 more accounts. Dorian read the note and placed it face down and looked across the open floor to the new office he had requisitioned that morning, where, through the glass wall, Celine Marsh sat at a desk with a working light and 4 monitors and her legal pad and her 2 pens, her green dress visible and unhidden, her cardigan folded over the back of the chair like something she no longer needed to wear. She was on the phone. She was not looking at him. She was speaking with the forensic audit firm in the precise, authoritative cadence of someone who had stopped reducing herself to fit the room and had started letting the room find her dimensions instead. Dorian Voss watched her through the glass for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Rafferty. "The 3 accounts she found," he said. "I want names by end of day." "Already working on it," Rafferty said. "Good." He set the phone down. He did not stop watching her. Through the glass wall she looked up, once, and found him watching, and she held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she returned to her call. 3 seconds was not long. 3 seconds was the longest she had ever voluntarily held his attention without looking away. He understood it as the thing it was, a beginning. The first of a very long series of days in which she would take up exactly the space she occupied, without apology, and he would be watching every one of them, and the city outside would be whatever weather it chose to be, and nothing would flicker above her head ever again. If this story found you at the right moment, if you felt something in Celine's correction of that letter, or in the moment she stopped looking at the wall, leave this video a like, and let the channel know you were here. Share it with someone who's been sitting under a flickering light, waiting to be asked. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because there are more of these coming and they belong to you. Drop a comment and tell me what you want to see next, because every name I give these characters, every room I put them in, is shaped by who's listening.